Let's talk about good gauntlets, bad gauntlet reproductions, what Lord of the Rings got right 20 years ago, and what they got wrong now. Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria, and we're going to be talking about gauntlets and fleetingly mentioning the new upcoming Amazon Lord of the Rings series, which some publicity advertising shots have been released showing a gauntleted hand. And essentially this is a gauntlet that we're supposed to be familiar with by its basic design, based on a type that was shown in the original trilogy released 20 years ago. And the simple fact is that they got the gauntlets quite good. They got them quite right based on Gothic gauntlets all the way ago back 20 years ago, but now have kind of messed them up through actually quite typical modern reproduction errors. Now this video is a follow-up with thanks to Zach Evans, my mate Zach, linked below to his video, and in that video he quite completely accurately talks about a feature of gauntlet reproductions and something that they've clearly got wrong with the Amazon version of the series for Lord of the Rings Gauntlet shown here, and he highlights that this shows an error which we actually unfortunately often see in modern reproductions, and indeed I have an example here to show you. Now I'm not here to name and shame modern armour manufacturers, but there are lots of people in the world making reproduction armour today, and the simple fact is that different armourers come with different experience levels and different qualities, but additionally some armourers are really good at one thing and not particularly good at another. I know some people who do quite a lot of armoured stuff, you know, Zach's one of them, but I know plenty of other people who do jousting and combat on foot and displays at places like the Royal Armourers and so on and so forth. And the simple fact is that some armourers are much better at making certain elements of armour than others are, and this is something which was historically the case as well. So Helmschmied, the name for example, means helmsmith. A very famous armourer, Lawrence Helmschmied, was, you know, originally his family were famous for making helms, and indeed you had some armourers that made helmets, you had some armourers that made cuirasses or brigandines, you had some that made gauntlets and arms, and so on and so forth. So clearly there were specialists in period. Now today armourers tend to make everything because it's not a huge market, so if you're going to make a viable business you have to be kind of a jack of all trades and make everything. There are very few armourers who just specialise in helmets or gauntlets or legs or whatever, but quite simply amongst people who use armour and buy armour, and even who just look at photos of it on the various websites and Facebook pages and stuff, it's very clear to see that some armourers are better at some elements than others. So what is this thing? So if you've seen Zach's video linked below, then you will know one of the main things and one of my main bugbears with gauntlet replicas is the angle. And I've talked about this previously in videos, and I've ranted about it to lots of people face to face, so some of you watching this video might have heard me talk about this in real life. The angle between the wrist and the knuckles. So for a second I'm going to take my gauntlet off and illustrate this. So a lot of people, when they make a gauntlet, want to make an object which is in a straight line, okay? But the simple fact is that we have our forearm coming up in a straight line here, we have our wrist going more or less at 90 degrees across here, but when we make a fist, you will notice that fist is not perpendicular, is not parallel rather, to the wrist, okay? It is not at 90 degrees to the straight line of my forearm here. It's actually at a canted angle. Now that is partly because the bones on this part of the hand here are longer than the bones there, so naturally we have an inbuilt angle here because these bones and these knuckles project further than these smaller ones down here. Equally, obviously your fingers aren't the same length either. So our hand isn't a square. Our fist, when we're holding a weapon for example, or punching someone, is not a rectangle. It's actually got a slanted angle here, and it's very important that the gauntlets copy that. Now Additionally, when you actually want to hold something, so I just pick up a trusty stick here, when you actually want to hold something in your fist, it changes further. Okay, so the shape that your fist makes like this is not exactly the same shape as when you're holding an object, because naturally your hand opens out a little bit because it's now filled with the grip, the shaft, whatever that you're holding. Okay, so that changes the angle slightly. But additionally, you're presumably, if you're wearing armor and fighting, you're intending to hit someone. Okay, so that means naturally that rather than having a 90 degrees here and trying to hit someone like this, the weapon will naturally extend to some degree out. Now, I've spoken about this in previous videos because obviously there are degrees of this, and if you're striking with the weapon relatively at an angle, okay, to the thing that you're hitting, you're going to perform what's essentially a draw cut. Now, we do indeed find this with particularly curved sword systems, things like talwar, where you've got a disc pommel, which enforce you not extending the weapon too far out, but drawing the edge across the target. This is particularly applicable to draw cutting weapons that are intended to strike in that way. Okay, this is particularly effective against lightly armoured or non-armoured targets. However, if we're in armour, or indeed if we were doing sabre, but we're going to ignore sabre here for a second, but if we were in armour, we want to give a more perpendicular blow. We want to let the weapon extend out a little bit further because we want some impact force. Now, we often talk about swords on this channel, but now if we apply this to a stick or a warhammer or an axe or a mace, for example, then clearly with those you're not going to be performing a draw cut. What you really want to do is accelerate that tip and put all of that energy into the target. Now that means at the termination point you're going to be at least at this kind of angle. So that means ideally when you're wearing gauntlets, you want to be able to hold your weapon and still have it able to extend out a decent way so that you can actually move your weapon around and hit the target with force. Okay, so for all of those reasons, you need the angle between the wrist and the knuckles to have a forward cant to it. In addition, there is another angle here as well. So we've been looking at the fist that way. If you look at the fist this way, you'll notice there is a curved line here. The knuckles are not in a straight down line. They are of different sizes. So you have a curve here and you have a forward angle here. If you look at these very good gauntlets, which incidentally are made by Art of Steel, I'll put a link to their Facebook page below, you will notice that not only do we have that forward cant here in relation to the wrist, but if we look at the gauntlets this way, we have a curved line around here. So these gauntlets almost perfectly match the shape of my fist when it is either punching or holding an object to hit. Now, just a brief comment about armourers here. I have noticed during my decades of interest in armour, doing bits of reenactment and also obviously HEMA as well, and now looking at doing HEMA armoured fighting, which we're starting to do more of in my club. And I have noticed that some armourers clearly have a greater understanding of body mechanics and the way that the body articulates and moves than others. But additionally, there seems to be a correlation between the armourers who make armour also for what we'd call HMB or Battle of the Nations, the full contact steel stuff that you've probably seen videos on YouTube about, or you may have seen in real life, or you may know people who do it. It's a very specific type of armoured sport fighting. It's quite different to armoured HEMA fighting because we tend to go for gaps and they tend to just hit the armour for the most part, or just hit the people. We have certain types of grappling that they don't have. We use lots and lots of thrusting. In fact, most of what we do is thrusting, whereas they don't do so much thrusting and things like this. So it's a different thing. But one thing they are absolutely doing, and no one could ever question it, is they are hitting each other really, really hard. Okay. Now, not all reenactment fighting is like that. A lot of reenactment fighting, certainly in the UK, and I know lots of other countries, certain types of attack are not allowed, thrusting at faces, stuff like that, but additionally they're for the most part pulling their blows to some degree. So they're not trying to knock the other person out. They're not trying to, necessarily win a real competitive fight. In most situations, in most sort of public displays, for the most part, they're just putting a display on. Okay, so they're sham fighting rather than fighting, should we say? That's not a criticism. That's just, they're different activities. Now, the one thing about the full contact HMB, Bohurt type stuff, Bohurt, is that they are actually really, really hitting each other, and therefore the armourers that make the equipment also for Bohurt really have to make stuff that enables their fighters to hit each other hard and effectively. So they have to be able to hold a weapon in the right way, they have to be able to hit the opponent hard and deliver force with it, and obviously defend themselves from incoming attacks as well. So their gauntlets have to work. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, and this is when we move away from the points that Zach made, there is a modern type of sporting gauntlet. So what I'm wearing here is essentially modelled, it's not 100% accurate, but it's sort of 95% accurate, based on certain Italian mitten gauntlets of the mid to late 15th century. Okay, now this is more or less historically accurate. However, a lot of the Bohurt armour is not historically accurate at all, and they know that. Okay, they tend to wear different types of Under Armour stuff. The legs are suspended in different ways usually. Sometimes the articulations are formed differently, and the gauntlets are very, very different quite a lot of the time these days, because they've developed new designs of gauntlet that are essentially more protective for the hands for that type of fighting. So functionally they are better gauntlets for that activity. However, they're not historical. Now, one of the things they often do is they add articulations into the wrist in a way that's not how historical articulations in the wrist were usually done. Another thing they do is have a fully encased and enclosed thumb to prevent the end of the thumb getting broken, which is not something we really find on historical gauntlets as such. And there's various other differences as well. So with modern sporting applications, there have been types of gauntlets which have evolved to enable a mobility or movement in the hand, which isn't necessarily always the case with historical medieval and Renaissance gauntlets. Now, so coming back to the bad examples. So bad examples of reenactment gauntlets, and unfortunately I see lots of them, and this does also, I mean, if we look at the Amazon Prime Lord of the Rings gauntlet, that exhibits one of the main flaws. And I'm going to slip on an old gauntlet of mine here, which is an hourglass gauntlet. I'm afraid that the thumb has come unstitched, so you'll have to forgive me of that through use. But this gauntlet has very little angle difference between the wrist and the knuckles. Okay, so these are almost parallel with the wrist. That means that naturally when I hold something or try to strike something, you'll notice that these fingers want to slope down here, but the knuckle plate up here is sticking out, jutting out forwards away from the hand, because this is a straight line and my fist and my hand are not a straight line. Additionally, do you remember that curve we talked about this way? Straight line here. So these are quite indicative, unfortunately, of bad gauntlets. They are too much of a straight line with the wrist here, and they are too much of a straight line down here instead of being curved. So your hand, as Zach very eloquently puts it, your hand is trying to work against the armour. Now, when you've got someone trying to hit you and you're trying to hit them and defend yourself and everything else and fight, you don't really want to be fighting against your own armour. Now, I have to admit, you can't move perfectly in armour. There are compromises that have to be made, and whenever you put any kind of armour on, it will inhibit you in some ways, even if it's just weight and heat, sight, hearing, these kinds of things. But usually it does restrict your motion in various ways. And absolutely, when I put this very good mitten gauntlet on, there is all sorts of things I can do in it, and as you can see, I can actually move a stick around pretty nimbly, even in a big old steel mitten gauntlet. It nevertheless is not the same as not having a glove on. I am more nimble and can move my hand around more dexterously without a gauntlet on. So there's always a compromise at stake, but what you're really trying to do is minimise the amount of compromises, or at least have acceptable compromises. So, to conclude, good gauntlets, when you're looking at gauntlets online or even on an armourer's table or whatever, remember not all armourers are great at everything. some armourer might be absolutely fantastic at making every other thing but crap at gauntlets. It does happen. And I won't name names, but I know people that's the case. They're brilliant at making everything, don't buy their gauntlets. However, there are some other people who make fantastic gauntlets and then maybe crap at helmets or whatever, you know? So look at different armourers' work, but when you're critically looking at gauntlets, try and look for at least some slum degree of angle whereby the knuckles are curved forwards to enable you to hold and strike properly relative to the wrist or the forearm. And additionally, looking at the knuckle this way, you should have some rounded angle on here as well so that your knuckles can sit comfortably inside that hand shape. Okay, so I hope this has been useful and interesting. Do check out Zach's video linked below. Yeah, thanks again to Art of Steel. I bought these with my own money, so it's not sponsored or anything, but Art of Steel made a very nice pair of gauntlets and I'm really, really happy with these. These are the nicest gauntlets I've ever owned so far, actually. So very happy with these, and I hope I'll see you back on the channel again soon. Cheers, folks.